Good morning, good afternoon all. So I'm just giving another minute for the rest of the team people to join. We had a very good turnout. Thank you all for joining on time. Okay, so welcome all. So thanks again for another webinar from SHAVIK, and our fantastic Roshan is back with another nice exciting version of the Windows Virtual Desktop. So quickly going through the logistics of this thing. So yes, please add your question and answers into the Q&A whenever you feel, and then they will be answered during the session or after the topic has been completed. And obviously, you might have noticed that this session is getting recorded. So hope that's okay for all of you. And the last thing is there is a survey, a quick survey on the feedback of literally 4 questions. We try to make it very simple for you. At the end of the webinar, please, we look forward for your feedback, a quick response, and really appreciate it. And also, please feel free to suggest any other topics that you like to listen to in the coming months. Okay, so without any further ado, let me introduce Roshan. So Roshan has done a first webinar a few weeks ago with respect to introducing the Windows Virtual Desktop. Now he's back with a real practical formula to become a hero in this particular space. So thank you, and I'll hand it over to Roshan.
Thank you, Shrikant. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to again present to the Melbourne community or the Azure community based in Australia. It's my pleasure doing the second session on Windows Virtual Desktop. A quick introduction about myself. My name is Roshan. I've been working on Azure since 2012. I'm primarily an architect and an admin of Azure. I started off my career with SharePoint as a technology, so I have worked with SharePoint right from 2003 to 2016. Was the last version I worked with. I have done Office 365, or in those days it was called BPOS, then Office 365, and now Microsoft 365 as well. I have knowledge on AWS, and I've done the associate certification on AWS as well. My work background, I started off my career with Microsoft, worked there for a good 5.5 years, then transitioned to work for Microsoft Gold partners in different regions. And I've also been working with a Microsoft value-added distributor as well. So in today's session, we will talk about Windows Virtual Desktop. So the idea of today's session is to give you all the information that you should know in order to sell Windows Virtual Desktop, implement and deploy Windows Virtual Desktop. So hopefully in the next 50 minutes, I will be able to cover all the concepts of Windows Virtual Desktop and make you a specialist or an expert on this particular topic. This will be a technical session with some demos involved in it. You will not have any marketing or sales slides. So hopefully all the audience are excited to learn and get your experience on Windows Virtual Desktop. So everybody is in a challenging time these days, right? So COVID-19 has brought about the biggest, I would say, disruption in technology, and people are now forced to work remotely, right? So because of this surge, you have seen a lot of requests for the IT team to set up an infrastructure that caters to remote work, cater to accessing applications and data outside office. And this has now given rise to VPN issues where they need to connect from a house or a secure channel. Onboarding devices as well. They had to make sure that the devices are available with employees so that they can access the data from either their house or their apartment or even from hotels. So there are times that customers have actually gone ahead and implemented bring your own device in a matter of days. So just to make sure that the people are able to get in touch with the data or work with the data and be able to manage their work. Uh, Infrastructure capacity constraints have also been a huge challenge for customers, where now all their data they would like to store securely and like to store in an environment where they're able to share the data, collaborate, but also have it in a secure infrastructure. So making sure the connections are coming in from the end customers, there is enough space to store the data, there is enough space to replicate and have the data available across regions for customers who are spread across the globe. So all these has been the center of IT in the last 6 months. And one of the best ways of dealing with these challenges is to have a virtual desktop in the cloud. Now, a virtual desktop in the cloud gives you so many benefits. You can basically work from anywhere in the globe till you have an internet connection. You're able to scale because it's desktop in the cloud. So scalability is never a question, especially when you use public cloud infrastructure. And you're able to modernize and reduce costs. So you can look at the cost in real time and even make sure that you're able to scale up and scale down at any time, right? So there are customers who get peak traffic on weekdays, but there's more or less or zero traffic during the weekend. So it's about how you can plan your infrastructure smartly, and those are the benefits that you get from cloud. And having a secure desktop in cloud where all your applications are there and only the right applications are given to the right people makes sure that there is no data leakage or data loss. So these are some of the benefits that you would get, especially in these times, to have a virtual desktop or the virtual infrastructure running on cloud. And that is where I would like to talk more about Windows Virtual Desktop. So Windows Virtual Desktop is a true Windows 10 experience, multi-session Windows 10 experience. What do I mean by that is when a user logs into a virtual desktop, typically when you implement an RDS, a remote desktop infrastructure, a Microsoft remote desktop infrastructure, he logs onto a Windows server, right? But with Windows Virtual Desktop, he now logs on to a Windows 10 desktop. So the desktop which he's familiar with, which he's been using for several years now. So the transition, the learning curve of him using a client operating system for like Windows 10 is much, much shorter because he's been using it for several years already. If you are a customer who is still using Windows 7, then I'm sure you already know that Windows 7 or Microsoft has stopped sending out security updates and patches for Windows 7. Now, for some reason, if you still want to continue to use Windows 7 because of your application compatibility, I would strongly encourage you to run your Windows 7 on Windows Virtual Desktop, because on Windows Virtual Desktop, you will continue to receive Windows 7 security updates for the next 3 years or till 2022, yes. Windows Virtual Desktop is very tightly integrated with Microsoft 365. So if you're a customer who's using Microsoft 365 Business Premium Plan or higher, you already have the Windows 10 license, which you could use with Windows Virtual Desktop. So you don't need to buy any additional license. All you have to pay is for the Azure consumption. and it integrates with other security functionalities such as multi-factor authentication, conditional access, Azure Active Directory auditing and reporting, health service. All these things can be integrated with Windows Virtual Desktop to give you a holistic and a secure solution. Windows Virtual Desktop is an Azure service. As you know, Azure is now available in 60 plus regions. So you can make sure that you're able to get your desktop running from the closest region. Within Australia, Windows Virtual Desktop is available in all the 4 regions, which is Southeast, East, Central 1, and Central 2. You can choose any kind of desktop for your requirement. We have customers who are using D series virtual machine, E series virtual machine. We even have customers who are using N series. N series virtual machines in Azure are virtual machines which have GPU in them, graphics processing unit. We have customers who are using Windows Virtual Desktop from their house or from their hotels and doing AutoCAD designs. They're able to review design, they're able to render designs on a desktop that is running in Azure, but they are able to access it from their local laptop or even an iPad or a Samsung Tab now. So that is the power of Windows Virtual Desktop, especially when you combine N series machines or even high spec machine like D series and E series or G series. Windows Virtual Desktop has integrated a very interesting technology called as FS Logic. Now, to put it in simple English, FS Logic basically separates the user profile data and stores it outside the terminal server, so that you don't need to worry about your C drive being crunched with data or having performance issues. More about FS Logic we'll discuss in the future slides. Windows Virtual Desktop, when it was introduced, you had to have knowledge on PowerShell to deploy it. But now, I think 3 to 4 days ago, Microsoft made Windows Virtual Desktop as generally available, which means it is out of testing, it is out of beta. It is now under generally available, which means you can get full support from Microsoft if you face any issues. And now the deployment of Windows Virtual Desktop is from the Azure portal using the ARM template. So everything is user interface based. So you don't need to use a lot of PowerShell and scripts to deploy it. Again, you will see that in the upcoming demo. They have the client available on pretty much most of the device platforms. So on Android, iOS, Windows, and you can even use a HTML browser like Chrome or Edge or Mozilla to access your desktops. So this was a quick run through of what Windows Virtual Desktop is. In the upcoming slides, we'll go deeper into some of these concepts to make sure you get a full understanding of it. So this is your overall architecture of Windows Virtual Desktop. Right? So at the leftmost side, you have your client using which you will access your remote desktop. So that can be either a HTML browser or native Android client, native iOS client, or you can use a laptop, a PC, or a Mac to access it. Now the centerpiece, which is Windows Virtual Desktop, Microsoft managed Azure services. So these are services that are managed by Microsoft. You don't need to deploy, you don't need to worry about it, you don't need to think of configuring these services. So all the services such as web access, diagnostic, gateway, session broker, and even the database, all this is managed and maintained by Microsoft. You do not have to worry about it. The only piece that you will need to worry is the rightmost piece of it, which is how many desktops do I need? How will the users access in terms of authentication? And where am I storing my user profile data? Right? So these are the 3 questions that you will need to ask, get answers. And these are the only 3 things that you will also need to manage and maintain within Microsoft. So quick summary, you don't need to manage and worry about the typical RDS roles apart from the terminal server, right? So the terminal server or the session host is something that you'll still need to deploy and manage within Azure portal, but you don't need to worry about gateways, session broker, or even the licensing server for that point. So what are the Azure components that you will need in order to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop? Of course, you need an Azure Active subscription, a subscription that has credits or that has dollars in it. You will need to have an Active Directory tenant or an Active Directory infrastructure. Now, this Active Directory infrastructure can be your on-prem Active Directory synchronizing with your Azure Active Directory, or if you're a customer who is not syncing his on-prem Active Directory or who doesn't have an on-prem Active Directory at all, have created users directly on cloud. Let's say if you're an M365 customer and you have created users directly on Azure Active Directory or on Microsoft 365, you're cloud users. So those people will need to enable an extra feature called as domain services. Right? So either option 1 or option 2, you will need to have one of these two options for you to use Windows Virtual Desktop. You would definitely require storage for your session host, storage to store your user profile data. You'll definitely need an Azure virtual network so that all the machines are able to communicate with each other. You'll also need a virtual machine to typically host your terminal server or a session host. Now, there are some additional components that you may or may not need. For example, if you are trying to integrate Windows Virtual Desktop with your on-prem infrastructure, let's say, for example, things such as you have another application running in your on-prem, you want users to access both cloud and on-prem resources from your virtual desktop, you will require a site-to-site VPN. Or if you would like to have a better integration with your printers and scanners. Let's say you have legacy printers and scanners that you want to integrate with your Windows Virtual Desktops, you will still need VPN. You will also require automation and logic app if you're looking at auto scaling functionality of Windows Virtual Desktop. Again, more about that we'll talk in the later slides. You might require Azure Monitor and Security Center to provide monitoring and security for your Windows Virtual Desktop components. So these are not mandatory. I would definitely strongly recommend you to have them, but these are optional components when you compare it with the actual requirements of Windows Virtual Desktop. Now let's talk about the cost components. This is a very frequently asked question that I get, saying that, okay, how do I know what are my cost components that are involved in Windows Virtual Desktop? So first one is, of course, your Azure consumption. So you will be running some virtual machines, you will be consuming storage. So whatever you consume will be part of your bill. Plus, you will need to have the Windows 10 license. Now, if you are a customer who is using any of these plans mentioned here, you don't need to pay for your Windows 10 license. Now, if you're a customer who is not using this, then you will have to buy a Windows 10 subscription license. Remember, it is Microsoft 365 plans. If you are still on Office 365 plans, I would strongly encourage you to move on to an Microsoft 365 plan, either Business Premium, E3, E5 plans, so that you can leverage the Windows 10 that you get with your plan with Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, if you are a customer who, for some reason, still needs to run Windows Server on Windows Virtual Desktop, it is still very much possible. You can still go ahead and run it. But in that scenario, you will need RDS Cals with software assurance. You cannot use just the RDS Cals which you already, let's say if you already have it, it should be RDS Cals with software assurance for each and every user if you would like to run a Windows Server 2016 or 2019 on Windows Virtual Desktop. So again, just to summarize, Azure consumption plus Windows 10. Now you don't need to pay Windows 10 if you are an M365 customer using any of the displayed plans, or if you're a customer who wants to run Windows Virtual Desktop and Windows Server on Windows Virtual Desktop, then you'll need to purchase the RDS Cals. So it'll be Azure consumption plus RDS Cals or Azure consumption plus Windows 10 license. I hope that gives clarity in terms of what are the cost components that are involved with Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, again, another question that I frequently get from a lot of customers is they say that, hey, I went to the Azure calculator and I tried to create an estimate for my company. but the Azure calculator does not allow me to put less than 100 users. It restricts. I cannot put a number less than 100 users. So I've written a quick blog about it. The slides will be shared with you after the session. This blog, which I've written, explains you what are the components that are part of Windows Virtual Desktop and how you can still use the Azure calculator to calculate or get an estimate, especially if you are a customer who are 100 users and less. Now let's going into deeper of Windows Virtual Desktop, talking about the authentication or Active Directory options. As I mentioned earlier, you will need to use one of the options, either have Active Directory syncing with Azure Active Directory or enable Active Directory domain services, because Windows Virtual Desktop needs to be part of a domain. It cannot work outside a domain. For example, you cannot deploy Windows Virtual Desktop in a work group, right? So you'll need to use either on-prem Active Directory syncing to Azure Active Directory, or you'll need to enable domain services. So the other question which I typically get from customers is, okay, how do I select which is the right authentication option? Should I enable domain services? Should I use Active Directory? So which is the right option? So if you are a customer who has Microsoft 365 or Office 365, and you are synchronizing your on-prem Active Directory to Azure Active Directory, in that scenario, I would recommend you to continue to use your on-prem Active Directory for Windows Virtual Desktop. So all you need to do is just set up an additional domain controller in your Azure subscription. So let me repeat. If you're a customer who is currently synchronizing your Active Directory with Azure AD for your Microsoft or Office 365, all you need to do is set up another virtual machine in Azure acting as an additional domain controller. And you will join Windows Virtual Desktop to this additional domain controller, which you have created in Azure Active Directory. Which you have created in Azure subscription. If you are a customer who doesn't have any synchronization from Active Directory, or who does not have an on-prem Active Directory at all, who has directly created users on Azure and who wants to use Windows Virtual Desktop, in that scenario, you will have to enable domain services. This is a feature add-on to Azure Active Directory, right? Once enabled, it will let you join machines to your Azure Active Directory domain. For example, it'll let you join your Windows Virtual Desktop virtual machines to the domain, right? So very simple. If you are synchronizing, set up an additional domain controller. If you're not synchronizing, enable domain services. So you can check with your existing IT setup in terms of what is that you're using, and then take a suitable decision. Now, one of the most important components of Windows Virtual Desktop that you will need to deploy is your session host. Session host is nothing but terminal server. So in terms of understanding what session host is, it is the same concept as RDS terminal server, which means this is the machine that actually hosts your desktops, right? Within Windows Virtual Desktop, you can create two types of desktops. There is pooled session host and personal session host. What is pooled session host? This is a type of machine onto which multiple users will be logging in at the same time, right? It is one machine shared by multiple users. That is what is pooled session host or pooled desktop. Typical use cases, let's say if you have application like MyOp, right, or any other accounting or any ERP software where you have clients installed on Windows 10 and they want multiple users to be able to launch this client and access the system or access the database, then we create pooled session host or pooled desktop. The second one is personal. So this is one-on-one. So one user, one virtual machine, right? So this is typically used in scenarios where the user is accessing high compute resources, right? It can be things like an Oracle system or an SAP system, or things like AutoCAD, Autodesk, because these are applications that require very high CPU, RAM, and even storage. And they take up a lot of resources just to run and consume the application. So it's very easy to decide. If you are a customer who is primarily wanting to move applications to Azure, and these applications are client server based application, primarily fall into an accounting, ERP software, or e-learning software, then I would say use pool desktops or pool session host. If you are a customer who has graphics intensive applications, or if you have very heavy applications like, as I said, Oracle, SAP, or even data warehousing, and you want users to access and build reports and charts, then I would say typically use a one-on-one scenario where the user has enough resources at his disposal to work on that application. Now, we talked about the authentication options, we talked about the terminal server. Next is the user profile data, right? Now, in existing remote desktop infrastructure, these are some of the challenges that people have been facing, right? Remote desktop infrastructure, or Microsoft RDS, requires direct attach or storage to be directly available to the terminal server. If not, then there will be performance issues, right? User profile disks uses SMB-based protocol. Now, these are expensive, especially when you're trying to set up clustering of that particular storage. User profile disks were never good in handling Outlook files, right? Outlook and even OneDrive. OneDrive has had a lot of issues, especially when you deploy it on Microsoft remote desktop infrastructure. Roaming profiles, yes, they help you in certain extent, but they are definitely not, I would say, in line with the modern, with the latest changes that Microsoft, or with the latest demands that that end users have been asking for. So how does FS Logic eradicate all these challenges? So FS Logic, what it does is it stores the complete user profile data in a container, and this container is separately stored outside the user, the session host, right? So imagine a scenario where you have 15 users accessing a pooled desktop, which means the same machine accessed by 15 users. The user profile container, when the user is not logged in, is not on the session host. It is stored outside the session host. I'll show you more practically when we see the demo. Okay. And when the user logs in, this disk gets dynamically attached. When he logs off, this disk is removed from the session host. So in terms of management, in terms of performance, it is much, much, much better. Right? And all this happens in the background. For a user, it seems that he's just logging on to a desktop, and his data, which he saved last time, is just there, right? He doesn't really worry about, okay, is it stored outside the session host, within the session host? The end user doesn't really care. But this is more in terms of how it actually functions. It dynamically attaches when the user logs in, and as soon as he logs off, the virtual disk of that user is dynamically detached and stored on a separate location. Now, where can you store the user profile containers? Now, of course, you can store it in multiple locations. You can have a virtual machine acting as a file server on which you can store a user profile container. You can use Azure Blob, you can use Azure Files, or you could also use Azure NetApp Files. The most, I would say, fastest and the lowest latency possible. That is Azure NetApp Files. The most scenario, in most of the scenarios I've seen customers, and this is what even I recommend, is to use Azure Files Storage. This is the most cost effective in terms of pricing, and it gives you one of the best performance. So in my lab, which I'll be showing in a minute, I have set up Azure files for storing FS Logic user profile containers. Now, when Microsoft came out with Azure files, initially the integration was only with Azure Active Directory domain services, right? Which means only if you are a cloud user, you could use Azure files as your location to store user profile data. But a couple of months ago, Microsoft brought in the integration of using a Windows Active Directory. So in the second scenario where you're synchronizing your users to Azure AD, now you can use that setup to give or to use Azure files as your FS Logic user profile container storage. Okay, so enough talk. Let's jump on to the demo. I'll be sharing my screen. If you're unable to see, please mention it on the Q&A chat. I'll just share my screen and just check the Q&A just to make sure that everybody is able to. If you're not, just mention it on the Q&A so that I will reshare it. Okay, it seems that everybody is able to see the screen sharing clearly. Okay, wonderful. So this is my Azure subscription. I've logged in as a global admin. And here you see there is a new service called Windows Virtual Desktop, right? Now you can directly go ahead and create host pool Windows Virtual Desktop right from here. You don't need to do any kind of registrations. You don't need to register your tenant. None of those steps are required. Directly go ahead, choose the resource group, choose the host pool. Let me actually go ahead and go through all the steps so that you're aware of it. So I'll choose a resource group, which I have. I'll give it a name saying AD test, saying Active Directory WVD test 1. Now, what is this location? So this is the metadata, right? Metadata information of Windows Virtual Desktop means it is basically updating Azure and telling Azure that, okay, this subscription has Windows Virtual Desktop running. That is the only information that is stored in the metadata. As of today, the metadata information is stored in US data centers, right? Microsoft is still rolling out this service to be available in other data centers as well. But remember, what information goes into the metadata? It says whether this subscription is running Windows Virtual Desktop, right? So I typically choose US East. Validation environment, this is a production, so you don't need to run a validation for it. Host pool type, now this is what we discussed, right? Pooled and personal. Now, if I say pooled, it'll say how many max user session limit, right? So how many users will be using this particular pooled desktop? So let's say I'll say 15. Load balancing algorithm. Again, all these settings, if you remember in the previous version of Windows Virtual Desktop, we had to do this using PowerShell or command lines. All these options are now available on user interface based itself. So what is load balancing? What is depth first and breadth first? Assuming if you create 2 virtual machines to handle, or 2 terminal server to handle 15 users, breadth first means it's a round robin. So it will distribute the load across the 2 servers. Depth first means it will first push all the users onto one session host, and once it reaches the capacity, then it will push users onto the second session host. So depth is, it'll first move everything into one server. Once it reaches the capacity, then it'll push to the second server. Breadth is basically round robin. It'll distribute across 2 servers from the first go itself. So next I say, click next. Do I want to add virtual machines? I'll say yes. Now here you're creating your session host or terminal server, right? So here, of course, you can choose any region that you would like, right? So I'll choose Southeast Asia because that is where my resource group is also created, but you can definitely select Australia East or Southeast. Virtual machine size. Now this is where you can select what virtual machine would you want. This is your terminal server configuration. Typically, I use 1:2 or 1:3 kind of configuration. So what do I mean by that is, if it's power users, I'll say 1 core is equal to 2 users. If it's knowledge workers who typically use Word, Excel, Office apps, and let's say a couple of web-based application, then I would qualify them as knowledge users. So I have 15 users here. I would like to set up 2 terminal servers for them, which means I will go ahead and choose a machine with 4 cores. So on 4 cores, I will be able to cater up to 8 users, right? 1:2, 4 cores is equal to 8 users. And here I'll say I will need 2 virtual machines, right? So this is the typical recommendations that I go ahead with. You can have your own calculations made. This is the simplest one that I use. Give it a name. I'll say WVD pooled 1, right? Now here is the image. What image would you want this particular pool desktop to use? Now, these are standard images. You can create your own image, your own golden image, upload it into a storage blob and use that as well, right? If you're using out of the box, I would recommend you to use the version 2004, because this has the Teams integration features enabled in it, right? So use the latest one, which is version 2004. OS, I would always recommend you to use premium disks. And this is where you will need to select the right virtual network. Now here, I will be using the virtual network, which has my virtual machine acting as my domain controller. So let me open up my another tab and show you quickly that if I go to my virtual machines, I have a virtual machine named DCFS. And this is my virtual machine in which my Active Directory is running. And this is in a network that is 192.168.1.4, right? So which means I will need to make sure that my Windows Virtual Desktop is part of this particular network. So here, I'll make sure I choose the right virtual network, the right subnet, so that when I deploy, this Windows Virtual Desktop is able to communicate with my Active Directory running in a virtual machine. Now, if you are a customer who does not have an Active Directory or who is not using the syncing, then when you enable domain services, let me open up another tab to show you that. So in my setup, I have domain services also enabled. So if I go back to my home screen and go to domain services, right? So this is the location. If you just search for domain services, you'll get that. And you can enable only 1 domain services per subscription. Remember that, right? Once it is enabled, this is basically like directory as a service, right? Like how you have VM as a service, storage as a service, this is directory as a service. And once you configure this, it will also give you DNS, right? So as you can see, these are my 2 DNS servers for cloudme.live. So if I want to deploy Windows Virtual Desktop using domain services, I need to make sure that my Windows Virtual Desktop are talking to this DNS. So if I go back to my creation screen, here if you see, if I choose domain services, so this is the subscription, this is the resource group of domain services. And here I have the subscription 10.0.10.0, right? And if you look at the properties, it is 10.0.10.0/24, right? So all you need to do is make sure that either your Windows Virtual Desktop is able to communicate to a virtual machine running your Active Directory, or machine running your Active Directory, or is able to communicate with domain services, one of these 2, right? So I'll go back to Active Directory. I'll hit next. Here you'll need to give a username which is synced to Azure AD and is also having the permission to domain join, right? So it's vs domain admin at virtualsolution.club. This password. So if this user does not have domain join permission or is not part of your local AD domain administrators group, this will fail. Okay. Now, if you're using an Azure Active Directory domain services, then the user should be part of Azure AD admin group, which is an Azure group. So make sure that these are followed. Create a workspace. Workspace is basically a logical container. So I'll use an existing workspace for it. If you want to create a new, just give it a name, right? So it's basically a logical container that that makes sure that your host pools are part of a single unit. Your session hosts are part of a single unit. Give it tags. So if I click on review and create, it'll go ahead and create. So as you saw, in a matter of 10 minutes, you're able to now go ahead and create Windows Virtual Desktop, which in the previous version would take substantially more time. I have gone ahead and created, so I'll not create it. It takes about 15 minutes to create. So if I go to my host pools, you can see I have one created for virtual machine, one created for Active Directory and one created for Active Directory domain services. Each of them have two virtual hosts and they are up and running. I can log in to these using my client. So if I launch my client, one of the good parts about the client is now if you see clearly, I can have multiple users logging on to the client now, right? So let me go ahead and launch Tom as a user. He will log into the virtual desktop and it's the same Windows 10 experience that he would get. Now, if you are interested to set up these in detail along with me, in the month of September, I will be running a special webinar series where I will be helping you set up these labs. I will be doing it by doing screen sharing, and I would encourage you also to set up the labs along with me. If you are interested in such a session, if you're interested to attend such a session when you receive the feedback from Srikanth, do mention your interest and we'll be more than happy to help you set these up, right? So you will learn how to configure Azure Active Directory domain services, how you can create these, where do I give permissions, and set up the full lab of Windows Virtual Desktop. So if you're interested, please make sure that you fill in the details which Srikanth sends in the feedback, and you will be able to set up these along with me. So it's an instructor-led virtual session or instructor-led hands-on lab. So this is your Windows 10, right? So I can go do everything that I would like to do here. And if I look at disk management, I'm not sure if I'll be able to open up because I'm not logged in as an administrator. You will see that Tom is his user profile disk is dynamically attached to this virtual machine, right? Now, again, if you want to see the location of the user profiles, let me quickly show you that. So if I go back to my home, go back to the user profile containers. So I've created, so I'm using Azure files. And here, if you see, this is using Azure AD domain services. So this is the administrator's user profile data. And if I go back to the other storage account, you will see Tom's storage account is also on user profile disk. I'm sorry, Tom's user profile disk is also on Azure files. So all this has been configured and it is being, so whenever Tom logs in or Jerry logs in, his user profile data is pulled from Azure files and attached to the virtual machine onto which he is logging onto, right? So one of the storage account is using Active Directory for authentication. Another storage account is using Azure Active Directory domain services for authentication. So all this is possible now within Azure portal itself. We don't need any scripting or any configurations of it. Okay. So we looked into the authentication options, ARM template, pooled and personal desktop, and FS logic configuration. So let me jump back to the slides and cover the remaining piece of the session. So one of the biggest announcements that we have seen in the previous months is Microsoft Teams integration. A lot of customers, when Windows Virtual Desktop was released, were asking about Teams, right? So how can we have Teams working on Windows Virtual Desktop? Is it possible? When it was released, Teams integration was not possible, but Microsoft has put in a lot of effort to make sure that this feature is now available. In order to implement it is very, very simple and easy. All you need is 3 steps, right? On your session host or on your terminal server, you have to install a WebSocket service. Again, I'll be sharing the slides. The links are all available here. Once you install this, then you need to download the Teams MSI package. And in order to install it, you have to run this special command. So path of the MSI and log of the MSI, right? So I've also put in the link, which has the step-by-step information of how you can actually install. Now, once you have this configured, Teams works like it works on your local laptop. You can chat, you can collaborate, you can do audio video calling, you can do desktop sharing. All those functionalities are available. And the best part is that your Windows Virtual Desktop performance is not hampered because of running Teams on it, right? So the architecture is very well done. All your audio video traffic is actually redirected directly from desktop to desktop so that end users get seamless experience. If you do have any questions, please post them in the chat or Q&A. I'll be reviewing the questions towards the end of the session. I want to make sure that we cover all the concepts before I look into the question and answers. Auto scaling is another very, very important feature that I strongly encourage every customer to implement. Even though you have 15 or 10 users, deploy multiple session hosts. The reason is you will be able, sorry, I thought the slides were not visible, so I just wanted to quickly check the Q&A. Let me go back. So as I was saying, whether you are a small customer of 10, 15 users, or you're a large customer with 100 users, I would always encourage you to implement auto scaling. The reason is auto scaling gives you the functionality to start the second or the third session host based on the user load, right? So on a weekend or during off-peak hours, if you have lesser number of users accessing application, then you can maybe have 1 or even 2 virtual machines. But during peak hours, depending on the load, it can dynamically spin up additional virtual machines. So this will also give you a very good cost saving strategy, right? So I would always encourage you to go ahead and implement auto scaling. Now, in what scenarios can you implement auto, or in what scenarios does auto scaling work? So these are the conditions. So you can have off-peak and on-peak hours, right? So you can say every day from 9 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening is my business hours. From 6 in the evening to next day, 8:59 in the morning, it's off-peak. So what it does is during off-peak, it automatically scales down the infrastructure. And in business hours, it automatically scales up the infrastructure. It's based on timing. The second scenario you can do is the number of sessions per core. And this is most of the customers use this. So if you have more than 3 users per core, and if that server has 2 cores, right? So if you have more than 6 users accessing that particular machine, then automatically the second machine will start and the 7th user will go on to the second one, right? If there are 13 users, then 6 users are into the first machine, 6 users in the second, and the 13th user will go on to the third machine. And as soon as the user count decreases, the machines also turn off by themselves, right? So this is again a very good cost saving mechanism. Again, as I said, whether you're a small or a big customer, try to have multiple machines, smaller machines, but multiple machines, so that it gives you a very good cost saving functionality. Again, auto scaling, as of today, you still need to deploy automation account, you still need to deploy logic apps to do it. For customers who are not used to deploying these logic apps and customizations, it might get difficult. There is a very good, I would say, tool available, the third link from an expert based in Germany. He's developed this auto scaling tool, which basically gives you a user interface for the same creation of automation account and logic app. I would strongly again encourage you to go through the third link. It's a very good, easy to use tool, which gives you automation or it gives you the options to do auto scaling using a user interface. Now, Windows Virtual Desktop monitoring is very, very important, because you want to know whether your users are getting the right performance, whether your users are able to access the right data at the right time, whether the servers are performing correctly. So Microsoft again has done a lot of investment, and now they've come out with a custom script which is freely downloadable, which you can use to monitor all your applications, right from user session details to the server details. Again, in the quick demo, I will show you where you can get these details. Again, all this is available. The script, the queries are all available free of cost. When you enable Azure Monitor, you can definitely use those. I put a link where you'll get more details about this particular template, which I was talking about. Go through it. I think you don't need any other monitoring software to monitor your Windows Virtual Desktop, because this script or this workbook which Microsoft has developed pretty much gives you every parameter that you need to be aware of. Security plays a very, very important role. Now here users are basically accessing all your corporate data, right, from a virtual desktop. So what are the responsibilities of your customer, or you as an IT at the customer? You need to make sure that you have security right from the network control, which means, am I allowing users to access from a certain IP range? Am I allowing users to access from a company-owned machine? Am I allowing users from a certain OS level? All this is under your control. You also can define session host OS. You can deploy endpoint security. Even in terms of authentication, multi-factor authentication is the most basic authentication best practice that you can implement. So I've made a list of best practices that I would strongly encourage you to implement, right? Enable multi-factor authentication and conditional access, right? Make sure password is not the only factor using which you differentiate user. It has to be password plus either SMS sent to their phone or app or something, right? So you have to make sure multiple factors are possible. Enable Security Center and collect audit logs. So Security Center gives you details in terms of vulnerability. It gives you details in terms of security score. All these are again available within Azure. You don't need any third-party tools for it. Use remote apps wherever possible. Now, people think Windows Virtual Desktop is desktop as a service. Yes, it is desktop as a service, but you can still just publish apps, right? For example, when I opened up the client, you saw a desktop icon. I clicked on it and then I logged into a desktop. In the same location, I can even publish just the apps, right? I don't need to deploy a full desktop. So make sure you take an informed decision whether you want the user to access the full desktop or just the apps. Use Azure Monitor for monitoring. Very important. It is, I've seen a lot of customers after deploying coming back to me saying there are users performance issues. It's very difficult to just troubleshoot without knowledge of what is going on, whether it is because of resource crunch because of multiple users logging in or more than expected users logging in. So Azure Monitor gives you all this information. Have endpoint protection. I've not seen a lot of customers implementing endpoint protection on Windows Virtual Desktop. They think it is secure, but users can still download things, right? These virtual machines have internet connection, they tend to download, and that is where all your virus and malware attacks happen. So it is very important to enable endpoint protection. Also establish inactive and disconnection policies. A lot of times users, especially during the end of the day, they just lock the desktop and they go home. Now do remember, when it comes to auto scaling, it checks whether the user session is active. Locking your PC means that the user session is active, right? So you'll not be able to auto scale up and down. So mention your inactive sessions.
Thanks, Roshan. I think we only have 4 minutes left.
Yeah, so this is a couple of slides extra and I should be able to complete it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sorry if I'm going over time. So quickly talking about the last concept, which is optimization. Now we saw about security, we saw about monitoring, but how can we optimize it? Again, Microsoft has released a very interesting script using which you can go ahead and optimize your infrastructure. So I've put the link over here. It's a simple PowerShell script and it goes ahead and optimizes. It basically turns off services which are not required and make sure that you're able to get the best performance. For example, I've taken the snapshot here. This is before optimization. If you see the number of processes and threads over here, and on the right side, you see the number of active services that are running. Now, as soon as I do the optimization, you see the number of processes are reduced and even the number of services which are running are reduced. So this basically reduces the resource consumption of my machine to a good level, and the amount of time user takes to log in to the system is much better. They are able to log in and log out much faster. Okay. Well, lastly, I want to talk about 2 third-party solutions. Login VSI. This is a very good solution to have, especially if you want to do application load testing or user load testing, right? So if you're an enterprise customer, you have 150, 200 users, you want to test and make sure that your machines are rightly spec'd. You want a simulation of user load and application load. Login VSI is the tool. Nerdio for Azure is a tool that helps you deploy Windows Virtual Desktop in a matter of minutes. Everything that you saw in the Azure portal is done within the Azure portal. If you use Nerdio, you can do that in the matter of minutes, right? So just wanted to point out these 2 applications. I'm sorry, I had to run through in the last couple of slides, but if you do have any questions, this is the time to go ahead and post your questions. I'll open up the chat and see the questions that we have. We will be sharing the slides with you. Which country do you operate? We currently operate in Australia.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Roshan. So team, I think the questions which are asked in the chat have been answered.
Okay.
So if you have any further questions, please do put them here. I think we have literally less than a minute. So I hope you guys find it very useful. And yeah, especially if you need any assistance in implementing these things, or you're interested in the next workshops, which Roshan is going to run, yeah, please do express that interest so we can provide you with what you really need, rather than just trying to imagine what you might need. But otherwise, thanks a lot for Roshan spending so much time, and I can see that you're quite passionate about this, so well done. And thanks a lot for everybody for joining. So
thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for taking out time and joining the session. Sorry, I had to rush in the last couple of slides, but you will be receiving the slides and the recording. If you have any questions, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or visit my site, azurecio.com, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. So thank you very much, and it was a pleasure delivering the session to you.
Yeah. So we will be online for a couple of more minutes in the respect of everybody's time. We don't want to hold you up. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and we will wait for anybody who would like to have any last-minute questions. Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Lamar.